Eleanor Beardsley grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, but her love for the French language has taken her all around the world. A 1986 graduate of Furman University, she was also the commencement speaker in May of 2019.
And you can't know all of the pieces at once. You have to put it together.
And we had an opportunity to talk with her about how she became an international news correspondent with National Public Radio, NPR. Dr. John Armstrong sat down with her for part of that conversation.
Eleanor, welcome.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. Great to be back.
Well, it's great to have you. What do you like about working for public media as opposed to the private sector?
I feel like working for public media, you have a mission. It's to inform the American people, bring them the world, let them know what's going on, all sides of the issues. And you don't have any ulterior motives. You're not trying to make a profit. A friend of mine asked me once, do they ever tell you that you can't talk about this or that? And I say never, because we have the facts, we're reporting from the ground, and we're just giving the American people, everything they need to know a situation and describing things around the world to Americans, and it's great. And there's a real mission to it. We're doing a service. Americans are so lacking in knowledge about the world, and you feel like, when we were attacked in, just September 11th, everyone talked about how we're so woefully ignorant of what's going on in the world, how we're perceived, and that really needed to change. And I think NPR's listenership really increased after that.
NPR reaches 28.5 million weekly listeners through more than 1,000 public radio stations.
Americans need to know what's going on in the world and what the world thinks of us. And so it feels like a real mission and a real earnest mission, not for other reasons, but just to create a stronger, more informed public.
To follow up on that, obviously you live in France most of the time. You're based in France. Can you say anything about sort of comparison about the level of knowledge of other countries in France sort of compared to what you see when you come back to America?
Yeah, honestly, sometimes I'm kind of shocked. The French know a lot more about America than we know about France. Obviously, we're a much bigger country, and we've been the superpower, and so there's a lot of reasons for that. But I'll never forget, I was in Burgundy, like in this rural village, and there was this guy who was he was a butcher, a retired butcher. Just a country guy. I think he hadn't even been to Paris. I had lunch with him, and he turned on his television and was watching the news, and even the midday news had all these stories from, other countries. He was so well informed about the world, and that really said it all to me. It would be like a farmer in the middle of Iowa. Would they be able to talk about Germany and France? I just feel like Americans are lacking knowledge about the world, and I feel that the French and the Europeans in general are much more knowledgeable about world events. And you just feel, I've always felt that Paris was like at the cross currents of civilizations. When you're in Paris, I always felt I was at the center of the world because you hear about Africa, the Middle East, just places that I never heard about. Of course, I'm talking about growing up in South Carolina in the 70s, 80s.
And to follow up on that line of thought even a little more, one of the big developments in this country, in America, is populism and nationalism in politics. How would you compare the situation in France?
There are similarities. I was speaking with someone the other day in Paris, and we were talking about the umpteenth yellow vest demonstration on a Saturday where, stores had to close along certain avenue routes that they were going to have their protest march. This French guy says to me, "You've got Donald Trump, the Brits have Brexit, and we have our yellow vests." So this yellow vest movement was the people who felt left behind from globalization. It's a white movement. It's from the rural, the small towns, the countryside where people drive their cars. And this came out of nowhere. So this is France's sort of populist movement. And it's not just in France we're seeing it. We saw it with the Brexit. We see right-wing governments in Austria. We look what's happening in Hungary and in Poland. Even now Italy has a far-right government. Yes, we're seeing very similar things on both sides of the Atlantic. There's European Parliament elections coming up in May, and the right-wing party is Marine Le Pen in France, the far right, is uniting with Salvini in Italy. They want to come together and they want to have this far-right voting bloc within the European Parliament to take down the European Union from within. So we're hearing these sort of things that 2 years ago didn't exist, and I feel like there's a lot of similarities between what's going on in the U.S. and a lot of the conflict and just the people who believe in the post-World War II order and globalization and those who feel left behind, these sort of populist currents of people saying, no, we're not going to do it like this anymore. We want to break the system and start over. Or there are a lot of similarities.
In the USA nowadays, people receive a lot of negative messages about the news media. What would you say to a young person about why journalism is still a worthy career?
You know, it's changed a lot. It's continuing to change. And when I started reporting from France in around 2004, that was when, you know, the big networks were closing. CBS kind of closed, and then CNN, and then we saw the emergence of course, the social media, the internet, and so it provided a lot of opportunities for freelancers like myself. So that was good. Now we're seeing it's changing so fast, John. You know, people just taking to the internet and spouting their opinion and reporting on things. We need journalists more than ever now because there is so much, I don't want to use fake news, false information, conspiracy theories. It's shocking. I mean, I've reported from the war in eastern Ukraine, and I saw it as Russia was closing down all of these Ukrainian TV networks so that there would just be one line coming from Russia. You see the same thing in the U.S. You see news channels, you see television and radio, the way they talk about issues, they're absolutely just presenting one side, and it's totally biased information. And that's why, again, it's important to have a public broadcaster like PBS and NPR who have an obligation to the public by law to bring both sides fair and balanced reporting. I see, you see it in France, you see it in Europe as well, people with one side of the issue, but there's more and more now newspapers and televisions going out there and debunking conspiracy theories. It's hard work, we've got to do it. But there's not fake news and real news, there are the facts, and there's then completely biased, non-fact related reporting. So I would say that it's even more important to have journalists. NPR, we have people on the ground all over the world. These people are living in the places. They actually see and know what's happening. And you can't really get the full appreciation of an issue until you live in it. So we need to hear from people who know the issues, who know the actors, who live in the places. Journalism, I think, is becoming more and more important. We saw newspapers close. We saw a lot of consolidation, but I think we're coming back to the point where there's so much information and everyone's writing what they want. We need actually journalism more than ever.
You just mentioned social media and some of the problems that it can cause in terms of disinformation. What about for you as just a working journalist on a day-to-day basis? How has social media kind of changed your working day, say, compared to 15 years ago?
Oh my gosh. I mean, the iPhone totally changed my working day. I remember getting my first iPhone, and now I have an app on there where I can do, if I'm out somewhere in news, like there's a situation, let's say a protester, I don't have to have my radio equipment. Of course, I can record with my app. And I can also upload it FTP to NPR. I can do all of my news spots out. I can put interviews in them. Like when Notre Dame caught on fire, I just got down there and I used my iPhone to interview people, send their interviews immediately. I would wrap around it with, I'm talking to, and if it were in French, and he just said to me, and now we're standing here.
Joining us live now from Paris is NPR's Eleanor Beardsley. Eleanor, tell us what you're seeing right now and how much of the fire is still burning.
Well, Lisa, I'm standing on the left bank just across the river from Notre Dame, and I'm watching it burn along with thousands of people, tourists and Parisians. It's kind of quiet here.
So they can literally air that, within minutes, whereas before I would have to go back home to my computer, be tied to my desk, so that's amazing. I use Twitter a lot to find people. If there's an issue I'm following and I see a great person I'd love to interview, I'll reach out on Twitter, and I would say 8 times out of 10, people get back to you, and that's how I find them. I don't know how, before you had to find if they wrote a book and find their publisher and, wait to get a call back. That's great, and also to first reactions on the ground. If there's a fire somewhere, you can look on Twitter, and if there's somebody there, they might be taking a picture of it. So I use it a lot in breaking news and to find people. And I'm not actually so adept at it, but I'm using it more and more. So it's a good tool. And there are so many apps, actually. I don't even know that. I know there's Instagram, and now Facebook is for the old people, but I'm using them all. a bit. But lately I've been using Twitter to inform myself and to find people, which is, it's all very helpful.
Here at Furman, I'm an academic advisor to many students, and I find that for many students, Furman's foreign language requirement is something that, they try to avoid or minimize, or they're not very excited about it. As a person who really sort of does her work in two languages, can you maybe put in a plug for Furman's foreign language requirement, or say something about it?
Absolutely. I mean, when you learn a foreign language, and I always tell young people this, you are never wasting your time if you're learning another language. I don't care what language it is. If you're 30 years old and you're waiting tables in Italy, if you're learning Italian, that's great. Because you're not just learning a language, you're learning a whole way of viewing the world. It opens up just other viewpoints, and you realize that actually you are so American. And every country thinks they're normal and right, and then there's all these other countries with weird points of view, and we have our friends and our enemies, but every country thinks they're the normal one, okay? And so, but there's different ways of looking at things. There's different backgrounds, there's different histories, and it just opens up a new world. You can't speak every language, of course, and I speak French, so I have the keys to North Africa. I mean, I covered the Tunisian Revolution, and that was just like so amazing to go there, and it was a foreign Arab society. The call to prayer is at 5 a.m., and you can go out and talk to everybody. All throughout the day Friday, the crowds grew larger and larger on Habib Bourguiba Avenue in the heart of Tunis. People from all walks of life gathered to express themselves like never before, they said. The crowd was peaceful but bold and upbeat, at times singing the Tunisian national anthem. Everyone said the changes Ben Ali had promised in his televised speech last night were too little, too late. We're here to say it's time for him to leave, says Ben Kalemi. The country is bankrupt and he has failed on every front. He is no longer credible. The litany of grievances against Ben Ali go on and on. And that was kind of course I knew French for France, but I didn't realize how it would open up whole other swaths of the world and also West Africa. And when you can communicate with people at just a basic level, everything changes and they just relate to you differently. And it can enhance any career you have. Maybe you'll get to travel abroad, go on a business trip. Maybe you'll get located somewhere. And if nothing else, you'll just meet people and it will broaden your own point of view. And, Americans actually are seen across the world as monolingual. And so people are like super impressed when an American speaks another language, even just a little bit. It's very impressive. So it's definitely worth the effort. I would say it's one of the things that has the biggest payoff for effort is learning a foreign language. And you're never done. Americans like to say, are you fluent? There's not fluent and non-fluent. There are so many levels of fluency. Like fluent to give a talk on chemical weapons, or fluent to have a beer in a cafe with somebody. There's different levels. And you can always, I'm still working on my French, But it's always a little thing. People say, oh, I hear an accent. Where are you from? And you always have a connection with people with another language. I worked for the United Nations in Kosovo. But, speaking French just gave me a connection with anybody else who spoke French, wherever they were from in the world. And even other people, they see an American who speaks another language. So that gives you sort of, oh, that's great. You're seen differently. But it just opens up your world. It's an amazing thing.
Can you point to one particular issue or story in Europe right now that you think Americans need to know more about?
There's things that I can see that they're spun. There's certain stories in France. The Anglo media always has their angle, and it's always the Brits and the Americans. And it'll be this certain angle, and there's the stories we all love to do about the French, And sometimes they're just so wrong, or they're just so taking sort of one. They're not untrue, but it's just sort of taking one part of it. We were hearing about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And, it's a complicated issue, but I felt that this wasn't getting across, is that in France, the rise in anti-Semitism has been from the immigrant Muslim communities. This week, people gathered at a memorial service for a young Jewish man who was murdered 13 years ago. The ceremony in the Paris suburbs takes place every February 13th, but this year, hundreds of people of all ages and backgrounds showed up to honor Ilan Halimi. They stood together at the spot by the railroad tracks where the 23-year-old was dumped after being targeted, kidnapped, and tortured for 3 weeks in 2006 by a gang seeking ransom. Frédéric Petita, the mayor of Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois, addresses the crowd.
Ilan signifie arbre en hébreu.
Ilan means tree in Hebrew, and this is why we planted trees here in his memory. It's this symbol the criminals attacked on Monday. Through this anti-Semitic act, they wanted to murder him a second time.
And it wasn't from this sort of 1930s resurgence of World War II type anti-Semitism. Isabelle Lisi and her 2 friends came to the ceremony from a neighboring town. I'm revolted that someone has cut down trees that are the symbol of Ilan Halimi, she says. We've thought of him for the last 13 years. There are just no words for what's happened. And I felt like nobody was saying that because no one, of course, wanted to blame. It was not because the Muslims are also discriminated against in France. And that's why even the French government was careful about pointing the finger. But of like all the anti-Semitic attacks in the last, let's say, decade in France, they've all the physical acts have been, committed by immigrant Muslim communities. So I thought that needed to be said. The French Interior Minister says anti-Semitic acts are up 74% from a year ago. Another occurred this week when 2 public mailboxes decorated with the portrait of former Justice Minister Simone Veil were tagged with swastikas. Veil was deported to Auschwitz at 16. She survived and went on to become one of the country's most beloved figures. French Prime Minister Édouard Philippe called the recent spate of anti-Semitic vandalism sickening.
When swastikas are drawn on Simone Veil's face and someone spits on the memory of Ilan Halimi, it's a body blow to the whole nation. But we are not knocked out, and we will fight this tooth and nail.
And yes, you have to also show that those people are also, discriminated against. But I found, for example, a rabbi who goes out into the sort of, it's the suburbs in France, but in the U.S. it would be the equivalent of the inner city. But in these communities of a lot of immigrants from, Muslim countries, they've never met a Jewish person. They don't even know what really being Jewish, but they have all these stereotypes that they learn from an early age. And a lot of this, with this wave of like Syrian immigrants and all these people from the Middle East, it's only getting stronger. And you see the same thing in Germany now. And this rabbi would go out with an imam and they would fight this, what does being a Jew mean to you? What is, and they would try to educate people. But I felt that wasn't getting told the way it really was in the U.S. I think it is starting to now. Serfati is president of the French Judeo-Muslim Association, and for the last decade, he and his Muslim colleagues have been fighting stereotypes about Jews in mostly African and Muslim immigrant communities in France's suburban housing projects. Serfati says radical Islam has been behind anti-Semitism in France in recent years, but now it seems to be coming from a second source.
We haven't heard from the classic World War II anti-Semitism in 70 years. But with these recent acts, like Juden being written on a shop window, it seems to have made a resurgence. Something has unleashed it, and that something is the Yellow Vest movement.
Political commentator Christophe Barbier says the Yellow Vest movement has created a dangerous climate. The movement is a roiling cauldron of anger and hatred, he says, and the anti-Semites took advantage and slipped in, and everything spreads like wildfire on social media, including conspiracy theories involving Jews. For a long time, I'd see interviews in our newspapers, and they'd have French people going, yeah, I don't know where this is coming from, but everybody knew where it was coming from.
Of course, the Notre Dame cathedral fire got attention all over the world. What was it like in Paris? What was sort of the feeling among people on the ground there?
Yeah, it was like a wound. And everyone realized that this cathedral is not just about Catholic or religion. It's more than that. It's Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, Quasimodo and Esmeralda, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it has really a poetic existence for the city. And it is the city. And I think this stunned people. People were just the night it burned, I remember standing there on the riverbanks with, thousands of people. and there was almost near silence. I couldn't even talk to NPR on the phone because I felt like I couldn't. People were just so stressed, and I felt that panic myself, like watching the flames. They would not go out.
Here, people are in a state of shock. People just have these stricken looks on their face. There's sort of a sadness and a panic as we continue to watch the flames leap in the air and lick and burn. People, we see the water shooting up on the side, but it just doesn't seem to be going high enough, and everyone I know is wondering, why can't they put this fire out?
Can you tell us what is being lost as we watch this right now?
Yeah, it's just this huge cultural heritage. This building represents this magnificent piece of architecture. It's not just for Christians. It's for all religions. It's Notre Dame de Paris. It is not just for Paris. It is the whole history of France and really of Europe. This is the most visited monument in France and in Europe, I just heard on the radio, with 20 million visitors a year. This is a huge loss. The architecture, the symbolism, the artworks inside. This is like a cherished part of every Parisian's heart, really. This is the city Notre Dame in the left bank and the Ile de la Cité, but it's more than that. I'm out here. I hear languages from all over the world being spoken, and people are they're just sickened to see this happening. It really represents humanity and beauty and culture, and it unites all of us. Wherever you come from, you recognize this as a beautiful building that shows what human beings could do even 850 years ago. They built this, and it's a magnificent masterpiece that is burning in front of our eyes.
That's when I realized how much I was actually a Parisian. I have become a Parisian in a way, and also how that cathedral just means so much to people. It's been there for 850 years, part of the city, and some people were kneeling, some people were praying, people were singing hymns. And whether you were religious or not, I talked to them like Muslims, they felt the same way. It's a symbol of the city, and it really felt like a deep, so there was a lot of relief when it was put out and that the cathedral was saved. There's damage. I think, people are okay now, it's going to be rebuilt, but people were really panicked, and it felt like a wound to everybody.
Looking back from your current perspective, are there any particular classes you took at Furman that seem to come in handy at the moment?
Obviously my French classes, and I continued to work on my French because, I have to admit, I was not a great French student. I wasn't. I meet some of the French classes from Furman who come over now, and I'm so impressed by their level. I don't know. My level was not that good. I considered history my main major, and French is sort of my minor. But I knew I wanted to be really good at French one day, and I knew I would keep working on it. But at the time I graduated, I wasn't so good. But obviously, the French comes in handy every day. But, my history classes, I just can't tell you how much. I particularly love 19th and 20th century Europe classes that I have with Dr. Jean Bloch. And, oh my gosh, we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I. And there's the 75th of D-Day. And, Americans kind of know about World War II, especially D-Day. I feel that people don't know anything about World War I. And World War I was just, and I studied. All the stories I've done in the last few years about World War I have just been amazing and moving.
NPR's Eleanor Beardsley went to this year's commemoration and has this story about the U.S. relationship with France in World War I.
Even before the United States officially entered World War I, a group of idealistic young Americans formed the Lafayette Squadron in 1916 and fought with French pilots in the skies over the Western Front. At a monument just outside of Paris, the American pilots are remembered every Memorial Day weekend with speeches, music, and a flyover by the present-day Lafayette Squadron, now part of the French Armée de l'Air. The rest of U.S. troops started fighting in 1918. That was just as Russia pulled out of the alliance to deal with its own revolution. That allowed Germany to concentrate its forces on the Western Front. David Pike, a historian at the American University of Paris, says it was a grim time for France and Britain.
The 3 months that opened 1918 were truly a moment of great anguish, and you can imagine for that very reason how welcome it was to see American troops arriving in Cherbourg and moving then toward the front.
Things just come back to me from my history classes, and actually my husband, he's a journalist too, and he traveled the other day. He said he was going to Aix-la-Chapelle, and I said, oh, that's Aachen in German. And that just came back from my class with Dr. Block because we talked about the area in Alsace that changed hands after the Franco-Prussian War and then World War I and then World War II. And there was Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, and it just came back. And these characters that came alive for me, they keep coming back to me. Yeah, even people's quotes I would hear in class. So the history just is so crucial. If you don't know your history, you can't really report. And going to Ukraine and, even knowing just what I did about World War II from, the Russians, I was in a crowd in Ukraine and, they didn't really like Americans. This was in eastern Ukraine, and it was the pro-Russian side, and they hated what happened in Maidan Square when the EU, and they thought the CIA fomented that whole rebellion in Maidan when they overthrew Viktor Yanukovych. This is in 2014. They were saying, we want to see your ID. There was tons of people there. There was this old man, and he had just a chest full of medals. He had fought in the Battle of Leningrad. And I was like, oh my God, the siege of Leningrad. And I just wanted to talk to him. And you know what? Those people respected that. I had an ID that they had issued me from the Donetsk People's Republic, because they made their own republic in eastern Ukraine. And I could smell the alcohol on their breaths. It was a little bit stressful. But I said, this man, I had an interpreter. I said, this man has fought in the battle of, in the siege of Leningrad. This is amazing. I've got to talk to him. And they kind of stood back. And the fact that they saw an American was interested in that, because that's still the great patriotic war for the Russians. World War II is so close to them. They're just still talking about it. It's, we talk about D-Day, but the great patriotic war for them is still, and so that was a historical moment. I had studied that battle, and there he was, and wow.
I listen to a lot of radio and a lot of podcasts, and I think that you have one of the great distinctive broadcast voices. Is that something you've worked on over the years?
That's actually something that I have not worked on, and no one's really asked me to work on it. But I will say this, it's nice what you say, and some people do say that, but I have seen things on the internet, and I don't look anymore. Some people hate my voice.
Really?
Yeah. And then some people love it. But I think it reflects the U.S. We have Southerners in America, so we don't, and a lot of people say, I appreciate that you don't have a typical, NPR speak, or no, I don't. And they've never told me to do it a certain way, or it's just the way I speak. But not everybody likes it, and I don't know, what can I do about it? It's my voice, so.
Well, I guess you have a bit of a Southern accent,
yeah.
but more. I think you have a great pitch to your voice. It's very clear.
Thank you very much. When you care about what you're talking about, I think it shows. And sometimes I'll have a story and I'll hate my voice, if you're really tired or something. I realize how important it is actually But when you care about something and you really want to tell people about it, I think it just comes through.
Eleanor Beardsley, merci beaucoup.
Je vous en prie. My pleasure.